Good evening. My name is Canan Batur and I'm the curator of live programs here at Nottingham Contemporary. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this season's keynote presentation with Beatriz Colomina and Mark Wigley on forms, histories, and methods of radical pedagogy and trans-species imagination at the intersection of architecture, performative, and alternative practices of Lina Bo Bardi. Titled Radical Pedagogy in the Jungle Towards the Trans-Species Architecture of Lina Bo Bardi, the presentation will highlight Lina Bo Bardi's practice as an experimental pedagogue, making a radical call for a trans-species architecture that remains very urgent and relevant in the here and now. For those of you who are with us for the first time, we often invite artists, thinkers, scholars to collaborate with us on opening up our curatorial research and program and artistic propositions within our current exhibitions. These interventions and subversions of dominant modes of thought allow us to dwell on complex questions and eventually new methodologies for rewriting the artistic canon, the dominant historiographies, and for making critical thought public. Before introducing our guests, I would like to share a brief housekeeping note. Our live programs open up different interventions and propositions within our curatorial research across the organization, and this event expands on our current research strand, Emergency and Emergence, a multi-platform program that looks into transdisciplinary, sensorial, and speculative practices of radical sense-making and wayfinding, to think about and investigate how to move from crisis to renewal, from emergency to emergence. This event is also an extension of our current series, the Adventure Playground, Architecture of Contemporary Play, of explanatory talks and propositions that investigates processes of play and imagination and their role in built environments and design spaces of playgrounds, bringing forward the architectural and political history of playgrounds as dedicated spaces for children across contemporary cities and centers on the idea of creating worlds. I'd like to take this opportunity to show our gratitude to the University of Nottingham, Nottingham Trent University, and Paul Mellon Center for generously and graciously supporting today's event, as well as acknowledging my colleagues, Philippa Douglas, Shannon Charlesworth, Andy Batson, Tom Chamberlain, Paul Buddle, and Amelia as well for making this event possible. Although we will keep an informal atmosphere throughout the evening, our talks, performances, and screenings seek to create challenging environments where open-mindedness and respect for each other's approaches and perspectives can foster growth. So please be mindful and respectful of each other's opinions and views. So without further delay, I would like to introduce our speakers today. Beatriz Colomina is the Howard Crosby Butler Professor of the History of Architecture at Princeton University and the founding director of the Media and Modernity program at the Princeton University. She writes and curates on questions of design, art, sexuality, and media, and her writings have been translated into more than 25 languages. Her books include Sexuality in Space, published by Princeton Architectural Press in 1992, Privacy and Publicity, Modern Architecture as Mass Media, published by, again, MIT Press in 1994, Domesticity at War, published again by MIT Press and Akhtar in 2007, Clip, Stamp, Fold, The Radical Architecture of Little Magazines, 196X, 197X, published by Akhtar in 2010, Manifesto Architecture, The Ghost of Minds, published by Sternberg Press in 2014. I mean, there are so many more, actually, dear Beatrice. I'm just going to talk about your recent publication, Radical Pedagogies, that was just published in June 2022, a month ago. So if you happen to find it in a bookshop, which will be also available in our bookstore in the upcoming days, please do get your hands on a copy because it's a brilliant anthology of so many different practices, especially in relation to radical pedagogy. In 2016, she was chief curator with Mark Wigley on the third Istanbul Design Biennial. In 2018, she was made honorary doctor by the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and 2020 she was awarded the Ada Louise Huxtable Prize for her contributions to the field of architecture. And I'm also delighted to introduce Mark Wigley, who is the professor of architecture and dean emeritus of Columbia University. He is a historian, theorist, and critic who explores the intersection of architecture, art, philosophy, culture, and technology. His books include Konrad Waschmann's Television, Post-Architectural Transmissions, published by Sternberg Press in 2020, Passing Through Architecture, The 10 Years of Gordon Matta Clark, published by Power Station of Art in 2019. Cutting Matta Clark, An Architecture Investigation, published by Lars Müller in 2018. Are We Human? Notes on an Archaeology of Design, written with Beatriz Colomina as well. Sorry, I just lost it. And published by Lars Müller in 2016. Buckminster Fuller, Architecture in the Age of Radio, published again by Lars Müller in 2015. Constance, New Babylon, The Hyper Architecture of Design, published in 1919, and it goes on. So I'll do recommend checking his bibliography out as well. He has curated exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art, the Drawing Center, Columbia University, with the DeWitt Center for Contemporary Art, New Institute, and the Canadian Center for Architecture. Most recently, he curated Passing Through Architecture, the 10 Years of Gordon Matta Clark at the Power Station of Art in Shanghai from 2019 to 2020. So without further ado, after this long introduction, I'll ask Beatrice and Mark to deliberate further. Thank you so much for being here and accepting our invitation this evening.
Thank you very much for your very generous introductions and for inviting us to be here to speak with you. We were very excited to hear that there was this exhibition from Ensemble. It was inspired by Lina Bo, and we normally don't collaborate. We did collaborate for the Are We Human exhibition in Istanbul, but we have been recently collaborating also on Lina Bo Bardi, so we jump on the occasion for that reason as well, right? So we are very happy to be part of this event and celebrating this fantastic place and this great exhibition. And thinking a little bit about this question of what Lina Bo is for all of us today, right?
Yeah, well, maybe Lina Bo is like the least boring person in architecture, so we have to be really careful not to be boring with you on a Saturday afternoon. So I think the idea is we're going to, Beatrice will talk a bit and then I will talk a bit. We try to show you in which way maybe you could think about Lina Bo being as a radical pedagogue, right? As a really hardcore experimental thinker, even not just when she's teaching or organizing teaching, but in the architecture itself, right? And in that story, children are like at the absolute center of everything. So it was great to walk into the gallery and the kids were totally in control as architects.
Right.
So we talk a little bit about that.
Right. It's interesting that in the book that you mentioned, the Radical Pedagogy, of course, which is about radical pedagogies in architecture. Lina Bo also has a part because she was actually a pedagogue in architecture too, and wrote this thesis about the teaching of architecture to get the chair of architecture in Sao Paulo, which she didn't get, by the way, because the world was not prepared for her, I guess. But what we were going to focus more is in this other aspect of her work that is more related to her architecture and to the pedagogy that the work itself implies, and then maybe in the discussion we can bring some other aspects. So I'll start with...
So I leave you to it, but so this is the theory, not boring, but also not a historical figure, like a figure for the future. So what's interesting about Lina Bo is she might be, in a certain way, more active now than ever before.
Right.
Anyway, I'm off.
These earrings are making noise, I'm going to take them off. So, first question is why Lina Bo all of a sudden, right? Because for a long time, in the histories of architecture, she was such a neglected figure. And all of a sudden, there's this continuous flood of publication, exhibitions in more recent years, that has made it possible for us to look at her with, in a way, fresh eyes. And you know, here you have, for example, this remarkable architect of some of the most influential buildings of the 20th century that was nevertheless neglected by all the historians of architectures. Here you have on top of the MASPI, the Museum of Art in Sao Paulo, guiding the construction, right? Or here in her celebrated Casa de Vidrio, the glass house that she built for herself, and Pietro Bardi in Sao Paulo, and again in the house, but yet somehow still an alone and isolated figure, not understood, somehow perched on the edge of the building and perhaps on the edge of the discipline, and never quite entering that space. And as I said, the continuous, on the other hand, flood of publications and exhibitions in the last 2 decades have made it possible, in a way, to look at her work with fresh eyes, and to see not just what is relevant, but almost as a revelation of everything that we are concerned with these days, whether it's gender, sexuality, race, interspecies relationships, plant life. It is as if this long and, if you want, cruel silence in architecture had incubated a radical diversity of points of view and new ways of thinking about architecture and new questions, none of which have even begun to be answered, and that's why I think we are all interested in. Without this long silence, perhaps Lina would simply have been added to the canon as a token female architect, of course. Usually you would have been playing a supportive role, and you can imagine all the supporting of PM Bardi, Pietro Bo Bardi, because he was married with Kim, and there were all this collaboration, supportive of Gio Ponti, with whom she had collaborated also in her early years in Milan as a young architect, with Bruno Zevi, with whom she had an affair as well, and there was some collaboration, and all of this, but also, you know, always playing this supportive role, or somehow reinforcing certain stereotypes of Latin American architecture. So really an interesting chain of roles. And on the other hand, her shocking absence, because it's really shocking, from all the canonic histories of modern architecture. You can look at them now, it doesn't matter whether it's Manfredo Tafuri or Kenneth Frampton or Alan Colquhoun or any of the great historians of the 20th century, and even relatively recent ones writing in the 90s, even reviewing their own histories, like Kenneth Frampton does regularly, you know, the next edition, and where is Lina Bo? None, nowhere, right? And so I think it's in a way this absence has liberated her. She doesn't fit the narrow moralistic stories. She breaks free. She confuses the discipline. She opens new questions and keeps opening them, because the reading of the work is not just, it's just only the beginning. For all the sudden celebrations in books, catalogs, exhibitions, films, etc. in the last 20 years, Lina Bo still surprises all of us, perhaps because what she really is challenging is architecture itself. I don't think it's by chance that artists were the first to sense this otherness of Lina Bo. It was as if she was speaking to them directly, and it's not by accident that we are here in an art museum, and that the work is by ensemble. Here, for example, you have the exhibition that Madelon Brissendorf did with ensemble of Lina Bo, or the series of exhibitions organized by Hans Ulrich Olbricht with Gilbert and George here, or Isaac, Julian, and so many other artists, contemporary artists that have been inspired by Lina Bo Bardi. I think it is as if she was speaking to them before even architects were able to receive the message. And art, of course, here for her is not something high, her own art, because she's actually an artist too, right? It's not something high or detached or global, but something that is very much interlaced with the everyday, like in the signs of these chairs for the MASP, with the local, with all these toys for children, with the political, and all these collaborations with anthropologists, with activists of every kind, with the interspecies, etc. The paradox of Lina Bo is that she produced some of the most iconic works of modern architecture, as you know, the Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo, her own glass house, etc. But still, in a way, she threatens with these kinds of things the very idea of modernity and of architecture itself. And this lifelong, if you want, shaking of the foundations of architecture, you can argue that was actually incubated in the literal shaking and destruction of buildings during World War II in Italy. Lina Bo lived through a period of intense bombardments in Milan immediately after graduating in architecture in Rome. She moved to Milan, and Mussolini have entered the war precisely in June 10th, 1940, so it's exactly 1 month after the arrival of Lina in Milan, and the city was bombed 10 times, 10 times between her arrival and December. So 10 times in like a few months, right? A time when nothing was built, she rise, but by destroy. Bo describes this city in flames, the city of Milan, with crumbling buildings and the terror of constantly running to bomb shelters. And this is, by the way, an image of Milan during this moment. Years she writes that should have been of sunshine and blue skies and happiness I spent underground, running and taking shelter from bombs and machine guns. And this is one of the magazines that she was doing at the time, Actualità, Architettura, Abitazione, Arte, which is also, she writes in the first edition, A is for anxiety. Of course, the anxiety of these years, as you can see, is a lot of this is dedicated, of course, to the destruction of works of art that is happening in this moment, but also the horror of the atomic bomb, even bunker hotels that were kind of appearing apparently in Milan in those years. To make it really more poignant, on the morning of August 13, the building where Bo had her own office with Carlo Pagani in Via Gesù was completely demolished, barring all their work. Carlo Pagani was her partner, also her intimate partner, and all their work was buried in the rubble. This is Lina in front of their studio. That's where they live and where they work, and this is the destruction of her space, of her house and her study. In a symptomatic mixing of architecture, art, media, intimate relationships, surrealism, and anxiety, Bo recalls that she, an architectural schoolmate and surrealist painter, Fabrizio Clerici, a friend of hers who had also studied architecture in Rome, were at her house and the house of Lina one night, and they were caught in a bombing that hit their neighboring building, and after they had missed themselves the alarm, and they were running through the streets towards the shelter, holding hands, with Clerici suddenly stopped and laugh at the way they must have looked, he said, like ragazzi disastrati, which means like children in like a, running through the streets, through the bomb streets of the city that apparently the painter Achille Beltrami have illustrated during the First World War in the cover of the magazine La Domenica del Corriere. Here is the Domenica del Corriere, and this is Beltrami and the kind of illustrations he was doing, in this case, of course, of the destruction of London. And she keeps saying, this produced a sudden shared sense of calm in the moment of deep panic, which remained until they arrived at the Scala shelter, the bomb shelter, only to find that the door had been already locked. But Clerici successfully negotiated for them to get in, and eventually, and he apparently, Clerici stroked a cat for hours until the attack ended. This is what Lina Bo describes, right? So there is not really a line between realism and surrealism, as there never will be actually with the work of Lina Bo. She found a way for architecture in a way to stroke animals. She's always very much into cats in the face of danger. The war made Lina Bo anxious, and how could it not make her anxious? And yet this seems to have baffled her contemporaries, even her closest colleagues and friends like Carlo Pagani, who himself had been deployed to Corsica and injured in a torpedo attack that sank his ship, and he was deeply injured in a hospital, and nevertheless he keeps complaining that she is anxious. What? I mean, shouldn't you be anxious too, right? But nevertheless he keeps expressing this frustration with Bo's capricious and erratic behavior while she was in charge of the office and this magazine Stile that they had been co-editing together along with all the magazines that they were working on with Gio Ponti, like Domus and Quaderno di Domus and Tempo, Gracia, Cordelia, Belleza, all these magazines that she was working. She was working in a lot of different magazines during this period. The tired goddess, La Dea Stanca, is how Valentino Bompiani, who was an influential Milan publisher, said of Bo Bardi. A goddess then, a powerful figure, a force in a hyper masculine world that was now somehow threatened by the savagery of war. She was overwhelmed with anxiety, as were so many soldiers and so many citizens, and countless, as you know, artists and intellectuals that had suffered numerous nervous breakdown. But we don't count this against them, right? When we read about all these artists that were caught in the middle of World War II or World War I, and they suffered all kinds of nervous breakdown, we write about them with respect. And everybody talks about her as if there was a problem because she was suffering from this brutality. Aquilina, and here is actually at the end of the war, where she made a documentary of the devastation of war in Italy, together with the photographer Federico Palantino, and they went along different places in Italy documenting the huge destruction of Italy. And here she's actually with children in the streets of Milano after the liberation of the photographer is the same, Palantino, and it's during the time that she's doing this report on the destruction of Italy. But anyway, going back to her childhood, Aquilina Bo, that's how she was born, had already been an anxious child growing up in Rome, anxious even of Rome itself, afraid of what she called its damaged beauty. As a kid, she writes, I was afraid of all the beauty in Rome, and I asked myself, why is everything in ruins? All her life, she seems to have been obsessed with ruins of the past civilizations, ruins of wars, ruins of earthquakes. She claimed actually to have lived through an earthquake when she was still inside her mother. She writes, 15 days before my birth, I experienced the earthquake of Avezzano in my mother's womb. This is Avezzano and the destruction that this really strong earthquake caused. Apparently she was already born when the earthquake happened, and maybe she was 6 months old. And this inaccuracy is repeated by all the scholarships about Bo, which strangely enough take the form of a police interrogation. It's really amazing. I encourage you to look at any of these historians that claim to like Bo, but unlike other architects that of course they fantasize about their own past, and they take the form of a police interrogation. If she writes an article, they question, did she write it, or did Pagano help her, or did she write it, or was also Gio Ponti? I mean, even if her signature is there, and even if you have a manuscript, they take the form of a police interrogation of whether it is this that she possibly could have written that or done that work. Is really extraordinary. And one of the things that struck me more is this thing that she makes this remark about living through this earthquake inside her mother, and it turns out that she was already born, and they all claim, oh, well, you see, she invents things, you know. So it's continuously repeated. So it's strange to me because we don't ask the same questions of our male architects, who of course all romanticize their own histories as part of their self-construction, part of the work itself. With Lina Bo, it is as if poetry itself was illegal. But if we are going, you know, and then in fact, I think the association of earthquake and bomb is really interesting and takes us to the truth of Bo. It deepens the emotional and intellectual position. Earthquake, in a way, is birthing destruction as the beginning of something. And here you have her arriving in Brazil with Pietro Maria Bardi. What Bo was like about Rio de Janeiro arriving in Brazil in 1947, and here they are descending from the plane, was the absence of ruins, precisely. She says, I felt I was in an imaginable country where everything was possible. I felt happy, and Rio had no ruins. So what she likes about Rio de Janeiro is that there are no ruins here. Brazil, in that sense, is her new starting point. The Bo of Brazil was born out of an anxiety of a ruined Europe, that's his case, that will keep returning in a way in her work, like some sort of a trauma, right? Think, for example, of all the jagged holes in Pompeii, which are so reminiscent of the holes left in buildings after bomb blasts, the same holes that you would have seen in all over Italy when she did this report. Think of the way she presented her work as if it was in ruin, and as architecture dissolves, the plants, the animals, the insects enter and become the real clients of her architecture. The strict line between inside and outside gives way to a new kind of hospitality to everything that architecture normally keeps out. So when Lina, and here is the entry acto para crianças, which is like a theater for kids, and you see this little kid, which is her actually, is a photograph of her, and these cucarachas, the tails, then all the insects with such fantastic care, right? When Lina designed her famous glass house, suspended in the forest like a tree house, she draws every insect, every plant, and every animal that is living in the site with the same precision she draws the building. For her, these animals are part of the building. Or if all architecture, you can say, it's always about keeping the bugs out, Lina Bo embraces this trans-species architecture where insects are not the enemy, but are treasured, intelligent members of the community. These are some of her drawings of insects and her models of insects, and perhaps this is a beautiful drawing to illustrate this idea that those are the real clients of architecture, and that humans are just temporary guests of these buildings. The otherness of Lina Bo is how she renders the human other. And then, of course, there is this beautiful photographs of her in her house, all kind of emerging from these plants as being a plant herself. And with this, I leave you with Mark, that will elaborate, who will elaborate more on this question of the plant in Lina Bo and all of this.
So maybe starting with this drawing, which Assemble used to make the exhibition for you here, or did Assemble make it, or did Lina Bo make it, or did the children make it, or did Nottingham make it, or do we make it when we walk in? I mean, this is the kind of thing that she's encouraging. This is what a trans-species architecture would be. But just looking at the drawing, and since you just came from this idea of a human being not as interesting or part of a plant, which is also part of a building. Here, the structure of the house coming up out of the plant is also true of this drawing. If you look at the edge of it, it's all plants. So there's a kind of a playground, but the playground is defined by plants. And if you don't know the building so well, you can see that actually the the plants are, the building is much bigger than it looks. It's not just this red thing over a plaza. The plaza is actually the top of a building, which is defined by plants on the front. And already in the year before the building opened in 1968, Lina Bo spoke about the need for children to be the real owners of the building and the real kind of future of the building. Of course, children perhaps are the future by definition. So if you're an architect and you're thinking you're making spaces for the future of humanity, then you think of children. And this is where she said that she hoped to recreate what she called an environment. It's interesting, she doesn't say create an environment, but recreate a kind of a garden where she said that the public would go there, they would see exhibitions in the open air. So a museum is not an interior, or the interior is something you find in the city itself as a kind of garden. And there you would discuss things, you would listen to music, you would watch films. And she said, I would like children to be playing in the morning and the afternoon sun. So always the children are there as a reference. She called this concept the living museum. So it means it's a museum that's self-alive, like a plant, because everything there is kind of alive. And actually this idea that this plaza that you should think of maybe as a garden would be a place for children was already realized in 1969 by this exhibition called Playgrounds, which was a solo show by the artist Nelson Lerner, and you can get the feeling for it, something similar to what's happening here in Nottingham. And even the way the building here sort of flies up above the ground at one point is a kind of echo. I mean, this is, as Beatriz said, this is, there's not a single architect on the planet that is not deeply, deeply jealous when they see this building. Everyone wants to have designed this building, but they didn't. This is maybe part of the reason that people don't want to talk about Lina Bo. She was too good. Right? She's just dangerously good. So everybody dreams of this space, which is an indoors, which is really an outdoors of kind of play and encounter. And of course the photographs show better that it's the children who are really somehow in charge. And here we're actually looking at the same exhibition. If you look at the space below the famous floating galleries, you can see another gallery, which is a sort of inside, which is also an outside. You can see the children are there kind of playing. So in a way, she makes a gap, she opens up a kind of gap in architecture, and in that gap is the serious work of play. She at one point, for example, designs this 1972 circus, which actually happened, a performance. It was the 50th reunion of a famous clown who would perform there. So in a way, the whole museum expands out of this little gap, and is a kind of subversive gap. Circus is not exactly high art, high culture. Circus is popular culture, is color, is play, and so on. But if you look closely at her image of the circus, you could also see that it's a kind of exhibition of art in that sort of sense. If you go back and look at the sort of early history of the building, because she's already thinking about it in 1951, she starts drawing it in 1953, she has the real project for it in 57, but they don't start construction until 1960, and it's not open until 1968. So this project really has this long kind of life, and at the beginning you can see that plaza was really not just sort of like a garden, it was meant to be a garden, complete with water and everything. And this is the moment where it floats up. But if you go even earlier, the whole building, that kind of gap between the floating object and the plaza was meant to be sort of oozing plants. You see that the plants are kind of coming out of the building. So it's a kind of a radical idea. Now there are humans in the image, and by the way, always children if you look, but the humans are kind of infantilized, are kind of small, are kind of temporary, are kind of vulnerable, even fragile. If you're under this building, there is always the thought that it will fall down. It really actually makes no sense, and what's kind of an engineering miracle. When you're there, it's really, you have this feeling like this shouldn't be flying. And if you have the feeling that it's flying, that you also probably have the thought it could come down. So when you're in the middle there, you're in a kind of fragile space, and nowhere could you be more human than when you experience your own fragility. This is a little bit what Beatriz and I are trying to argue. But just to give you the feeling, it's really kind of like a big kind of garden, a big kind of pergola. And look at the space, that gap between the sort of primeval thing. Again, notice that there are always children there, and there's also art there, but art seems to go from the deep past, like the forest and the trees and the liquids. So it's kind of a confusion of the adult and the child, of what's inside and what's outside, what's past and what's the future. In a sense, Lina Bo is a relentless kind of, she relentlessly undoes all the kind of binaries. Again, there's a couple of kids in the middle consulting, One of them, I have a feeling the one on the right might be Lina Bo. There seems to be an architect. She's holding her, sort of 10-year-old holding her scheme for the building. And again, a kind of a general confusion as to what constitutes a space and what constitutes an object. And of course, part of the project of the MASPI was, of course, that there would be also this encounter between the children and kind of high art up in that space. So what goes on, in a way, is a kind of classroom below the flying plinth, and then that's leading to a classroom above. She's not walking away from high art or from high culture or from kind of refinement and narratives and all of this, even from Europe where this art is coming from, but she's creating a kind of, let's say, confusion. The project takes the shape that we know it already in 1951 in this magazine that she was editing, where she conjures up the concept of the living museum, and you see it, a project for a museum by the sea. By the way, the idea that a museum could just go to the beach, you could say it's a super Brazilian idea or a kind of cliche idea about Brazil, but it's true that the very idea that the museum itself travels, that it moves, is part of the living idea. But also notice that there are kind of plants on top and plants on the bottom. And are these things in the foreground artworks or not? You're not quite sure. Is the building itself a kind of art object? You see it has a kind of garden on the inside of it, but which you look through. So if I'm inside, so who's looking at who? Like, for example, if I'm in this position, am I being looked at by the sculptures in the garden? Certainly I'm the stranger here, right? So a little bit what Lina Bo does is to make the human feel like not the all-powerful figure, but the stranger, or at least the guest. So she creates, in a certain sense, a form of hospitality. And you know, if architecture is a form of hospitality, which would be a really good thing, then maybe Beatriz and I share the fascination that so many people have with Lina Bo, because she's invented another way of thinking hospitality. Right? If you look at the plans and the sections, you see that the trees go up through the museum. So again, it's and you could say, okay, but if a tree goes up and through the museum, have you kind of domesticated, have you turned it into an artwork? So this is a kind of question for us to ask. Is this really about human subservience in the face of nature, or has nature itself been framed as a kind of a picture? And this question will never fully go with Lina Bo, but you can see it there. There's a space for lectures, a space for exhibition, there's a space for plants, and there's a space for education. Right? And every time Lina Bo ever talks about museums, she talks education. It's always about education. 1951 is the same year that she designs this project. This project, her own house, is identical to the museum. Right? It's just a little version of the same thing. Instead of going to the beach, you go into the kind of forest. You see again, are we inside or outside? Actually, here we are actually inside the hole through which we're taking the tree. This is the tree's view of her project. We are actually positioned in this drawing where the tree is that comes up through the house, looking through the house to trees in the distance. You can see that there are paintings, there are sculptures, and there are humans, but they don't know if the human is a sculpture or it's a painting, and who's looking again at who. So a kind of confusion of museum, of school, of cultural centre, just simply unclear who's in charge. Floating actually in a kind of forest that simply wasn't there. When she made the house, she said there should be a forest, so she returns the forest. Remember with the museum, she talks about recreating. So there's a kind of recreation of something that was, in a certain sense, already there. But we have to go back even further. 1947 is the first version of the Museum of Art for Sao Paulo, the MASPI. Here's her drawing for the entrance. It's in a kind of building. And again, at first it looks like a museum, you know, sort of typical museum. You go into a space that's kind of perfect air, perfect light, perfect air conditioning. You're not allowed to cough, you're not allowed to sneeze, you probably shouldn't talk, you certainly shouldn't behave. You don't behave like a human, but something like a church, and you distance yourself, right? It looks like this from the start. But were you to go in there, all these things would go into your brain, lectures, cinemas, movies, and so on. So already this concept of the living museum. And she constructs in the first images of this, again, a kind of a garden in which there are children, in which there's art. It's not clear, again, if it's a house, a museum, a living room, or so on. And there is a program of education to take place, and plants. Plants are always there. You can be pretty sure that if you're looking at a space and it doesn't have a plant in it, then it was not by Lina Bo. Right? Plants are always there. So even when you get into a more or less classical part of that space, the plants are sort of hanging out. It's not very interesting the way they're there, but they're sort of there. It's as if they just walked in, right, or across the edges. And these panels were what they called didactic. So these were ways of educating yourself into the history of European art. You see in the distance is a lecture theatre where you could go and listen to a lecture. Or you could study. So there was a program of school of education, and you could train. It was the first school of industrial design in Brazil. Very modern, you could see, explicitly based on the Bauhaus model. So it's exactly what you think a school of art would be in that kind of sense. But Lina Bo insisted on that there would be an art club for children in this space. So there was a huge programming for students, young kids, to learn about painting, about sculpture, about movies, but also to participate, but also high art in this case, for example, Van Gogh. 1957, as Beatriz referred to before, she's teaching at the University of Sao Paulo. So she's making all these buildings which are forms of education, which take the form of a kind of a garden in which the human is made to feel a little bit fragile, right? And then she writes this thesis to become a professor at Sao Paulo. She doesn't get the job because she's a woman, she's interesting, she's strong. There's every reason for her to not get the job. This thesis is about as sophisticated theoretically and philosophically as anything I've read by any architect of the 20th century. It's very explicitly influenced by Gramsci, the kind of Marxist theorist from Italy. It's an incredible tour de force. But despite this fact, everybody that writes about Lina Bo treats her as beautiful, romantic, colorful, a kind of woman's woman in the world of architecture. But she's more of a guy than the guys. That is to say, she's full force philosophically and theoretically. She bases her argument on Leonardo's drawings of the cataclysm. It relates very strongly to Beatriz's argument about the earthquake. Leonardo himself remembers as a child being in the middle of these unbelievable storms that ravaged the countryside in Italy, and he did these very famous drawings. And Lina Bo writes about the idea that the human is a stranger in the face of nature that could destroy everything that human has made. So architecture, whatever architecture it is, it appears as a kind of provisional, temporary way of making yourself a little bit at home in a kind of a strange world. She doesn't get the job. She starts teaching in the Northeast, in Bahia, and very quickly she's asked to become the director of a museum there, and she starts to design a museum. In fact, this is a renovation of a theater that burnt out like 3 days after it opened, and she made this kind of a lecture room. Again, you know it's her because she's put the plants in there. So the children and the plants and the art and the lecturing and education, everything is inserted into this space. You can see on the top that the girl who will sit in that chair can draw. You don't just listen to lectures. Everybody is an artist. She insisted, by the way, in her book on pedagogy in 1957, that the teacher must sit alongside the student as an equal, not to look down. So this is a chair to enable the student to be as creative and as effective as the teacher. There were exhibitions, of course, in the kind of a typical sense. She then goes to make the final museum in this space in Salvador de Bahia, and this is the famous MAM, the Museum of Modern Art of Bahia. Here she is renovating the building. Even her decision to renovate a historical building already marks a kind of incredible shift by which she's seeing incredible wisdom and truth in the so-called popular culture, vernacular culture, largely the descendants of the enormous slave communities that were in the millions that were dominant in that region of Brazil still. She's seeing in their lives and in their art and in their craft and in their languages and in their behaviors and in their politics the real kind of, as it were, future. So it's not a nostalgia for kind of folk art, and she renovates an existing space and makes a kind of minimal theatre set, because everything she's doing is in a certain sense about theatre, not by chance. This is the space in which, as Beatriz showed you, Isaac Julian will film a dance. And she was totally influenced by this 1950 project to finish with, which is the Parque Escola, the school park. There was this idea to revolutionize education in Brazil in 1950, which is that the kids would go to a park, and in the park would be a series of pavilions, and they would not only get traditional education, but they would hang out in the park, and it would be sort of like a kind of craft school. So here it is from 1950. This is in Salvador Bahia. And you can see it's kind of communicative, and it's not so, if you squint your eyes a little bit, you start to see in some of these tables covered with objects, literally the way that Lina Bo thinks, collaborative construction, the future, new generations and so on. And she writes with incredible passion about the brilliance of this kind of concept, and she uses this concept to revolutionize museums. And she will do this with everything. So this is a house of Lina Bo. You know it's by Lina Bo because it's not really a house, but some sort of confusion of building and plan. But it could also be a museum. It could be a cultural center. It in a certain sense, doesn't really matter. But it's amazing what she's doing here, right? It's not sort of architecture plus plant. It's not simply plants as ornaments. It's not even clear that this is, as it were, designed, right? This is just a sort of a blur. At a certain point, this is one of the very, very last projects, a huge project that she does for Sao Paulo, for the government of Sao Paulo. Literally, buildings will now be, as it were, made of plants. These days, by the way, if you make a facade that's all plants, you can become a famous architect in Italy, by the way. It's a good friend of ours. It's done already here, so amazingly, so carefully, and so thoughtfully. And I just wanted to note that this didn't just sort of start, it's not like she says, European kid hits Brazil, wow, everything is tropical, it's all plants, there's this other culture, this other life. No, it was really in the work from the beginning. These are very, very early works of Lina Bo when she was first collaborating with Carlo Pugnani. Again, is this a house for plants or a house with plants? It looks pretty much like a house for plants, right? A kind of plant house. At least it's totally confusing. I mean, certainly you would imagine if you were to sit down at that table, anything might happen to you at any moment from this plants, right? And it's complete confusion. And it's super interesting. I mean, I could go on and on, but I have to stop. But you see, she's fascinated with this sort of situation, where architecture is a sort of mirage in the middle of plants, but it's astounding work. So basically, her entire life, from a very, very young architect all the way through, she was looking for ways of confusing the kind of a living world of the plant with the living world of the human, right? And making an architecture here in Milan again that's half architecture, half not. Kind of a provisional, temporary architecture. Beautiful, amazing. And that's what will finally, lead to this sort of trans-species attitude that Beatriz is showing. So I guess all I'm trying to add to the discussion is that this other way of thinking about architecture, which is a relentless attack on binaries between the adult and the child, between the past and the future, between inside and the outside, between the plant and the human, and it just goes on and on and on. You name it, any binary in architecture, she dissolves it. She's like a superhero against binaries. And if you do this, what opens up is a kind of more kind of radical space, or at least it's no longer clear what's solid and what's not. And so much we think of architects as kind of making something solid because life itself is weird, and it's true, it's weird. And then we kind of ask architects to be boring. This is why I was saying at the beginning, she's against boredom. We understand that ourselves are weird. By the way, think about the inside of your bodies. If just for a moment I would show you the inside of my body, some of you would pass out, including me, right? In other words, we are weird, entirely weird, but I wear this so it doesn't look so weird. We ask architecture to make things even less weird. Then you get an architect by Lina Bo who says, what if we just turn it inside out and just sort of go with the live with the weirdness and so on. And this is a radically subversive gesture, and I think it's part of our explanation for why Lina Bo has not been considered for so long, is actually the work is even more radical than the people that say that they love it have. And that would be itself pedagogical, right? If she could teach us in this way, that would already be pedagogical. But it is the idea that Lina Bo might be, in a certain sense, the teacher that we need in this kind of next couple of decades or so. Who knows what we need, right? And you didn't come here to be told what you need. This is like confessions. Why we are obsessed with this architect, something like this. Anyway, we are happy to talk with you in a more relaxed way about your questions and so on.
Thank you. Would you like some more water? In the meantime. mean, where do I start?
I don't know.
Thank you so much for this such compelling, imaginative account of Lina Bo Bardi. You took us to a journey that I think given us a lot to think about, but also allowed us to kind of reactivate the concept and I guess the practice of radical pedagogy through such an imaginative and compelling and fascinating way. Of course, I prepared a couple of questions to kind of, let you digest this presentation and so that I can gather your thoughts and comments. I guess what will be quite interesting to start with, because I can see, in preparation for this conversation, of course, I have been looking into quite a lot of accounts on Lina Bo Bardi, and it felt quite reductive as you kind of started this as you said in the beginning of this presentation. Looking at Lina Bo Bardi's practices almost end over towards, transnational, transhistorical, trans-temporal, trans-species kind of, endeavor. And I guess my question will be, is about your research and methodology in terms of how you kind of brought this research forward, what kind of, systems that you kind of followed, in a sense that, you also mentioned in your book in Radical Pedagogy in terms of how archives are actually these structures that create this hierarchy versus, well-preserved, authoritative, polished and selective resources versus, oral histories, personal accounts and narratives. So I guess I'm just quite curious about that process of developing that, research and also putting her account forward in such a brilliant and imaginative way.
Right. I'm not sure. It was almost by chance, right? I was asked to write for this catalog that you actually have it in the bookstore here, the Habitat one. It was an exhibition in Sao Paulo, in the MASPI precisely. That happened precisely during COVID. It was supposed to go all over Europe and all. I don't know where it went in the end, but it was in MASPI, and actually we did see it in MASPI, and at first it was like, okay, I'm not a scholar of Lina Bo, but I start thinking about it and looking into it, and at first I was, you're always somehow driven by your own obsessions, right? So war has always been, for me, an obsession. Right, I wrote this book, Domesticity at War, but it's almost like war is always here somehow. I guess it's still this trauma of your parents, that in the generation of my parents, of course, that went through the war in Spain, but also the disasters of World War II. This is not my generation, but somehow. I do believe that somehow you kind of inherit this trauma, because I've always been obsessed with war in a way that doesn't actually reflect anything that has happened to me personally. And of course, the moment that I start thinking about that, I saw these years of Lina Bo in Milan, and the destruction of Milan, and this magazine that she was editing, and this whole anxiety and the whole ruins. And that started one aspect of it, but as the whole thing, and we were both on sabbatical and at the Clark, right? And the Clark, which is this art institute and somehow we start, as always happens when one starts a project, talking with the other, and before we knew it became a collaboration in which this whole question of the war and the neglect of Lina for so long, and the disappointment that I felt with what had been written about Lina Bo, and that I kept communicating to Mark, and the more we start talking about, the more we start seeing other aspects. So I kind of grew, no? Did you remember it like that?
Yeah, something similar. It's really so I suppose the answer to your question, obsession, right? So Beatriz is obsessed with war, so if you see war
everywhere.
there. I was getting into plants, It occurred to me when you were saying, because the Clark is this place in the middle of beautiful trees, you spend the whole day walking around, you're basically nothing but plants.
It's nature, yeah.
And then if you look at this image, right, and just, it's a little bit another answer to your question, as a question of method. Why not just look at the image and see what the image is saying? In this image, the architect is about the size of one of these leaves. So it just immediately, the photographer, and she's choosing this picture, and she's letting us see it, seeing her there. Like all of us are very careful about who we show her, you know, she knows she's being photographed. So she's being photographed as a plant where there's a confusion between her, the plant, and the building. So this is something interesting for an architect to say. So as a method, I think the first thing is just to listen to the architect. I mean, but really listen, like, and most of the people that write about architecture, maybe they are afraid of it, architecture, I mean, because architecture is very strange. I give you an example. Like I was saying before, when you're underneath that building, why you don't think it's going to fall? Why you don't think this is going to fall? You have no information. You have nothing tells you this is not going to fall. You just think very, very boring people in Nottingham made sure that this was going to happen. If you said, oh, an artist did this, nobody would come to this lecture. You have to say, no, there was an engineer. So we really call on architecture to repress things, to keep things away. And every now and then you get an architect like Lina Bo that's reversing things. And the same with historians. Every now and then you get, Beatriz is a good example, somebody that's always interested in what's hidden, what's behind, you know. So it's not so much a method, it's just a curiosity.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, historiography has its own way of working, right? Like, I mean, it can omit or include, and it's also another narrative, so it's, we know now in 2022 that it's rarely reliable. And I guess when you were talking about how Lina Bo Bardi was reductive in a certain way, that you were saying also she was romanticized, and she was also someone that was not exactly in so much in education, and someone was kind of looked, you know, from someone that people pushed aside somehow. So I guess I was quite interested in this curiosity that you developed of her practice as well because of that. And as I said, I have been reading quite a lot about her, and I found one, I guess it goes to this kind of, you know, harmonized binaries within her practice that you were talking about. One account was saying something that her practice was at the intersection of different worldviews, north and south, city and hinterland, privilege and deprivation. And I think it's a quite beautiful way of presenting who she is, because it's everything in between and more than that, I guess. So on that note, I guess I would like to ask a bit more about her general passion when it comes to pedagogy and, you know, museum at school. And as you know, our exhibition upstairs very much, you know, trying to kind of create this playground in the purpose of, I guess, pushing a different discourse and different methods of, you know, teaching forward rather than teaching creativity. It's about teaching with creativity and what that might be possible. And also you mentioned that she was in Bahia between 1960 and 64, and she very much tried to embrace this concept of museum as school. And then she also was creating shows there, she was teaching, as you mentioned. So maybe we can talk a bit about, you know, like that period that she was there, and then how, I guess, that might potentially change and alter her perception about, you know, what museum could look like that was manifested maybe in a much more materialized and solidified way in Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo.
Yeah, well, just, I mean, may I say a couple of things in Beatriz also, but it's interesting, when she was asked to make this museum in Bahia, she said, well, we don't have any art, but we should have it. But the art that we should get it because of some sort of educational idea. So she has really this, for her it's just clear, a museum is a school. But a museum is not a mausoleum, right? So she's really the enemy of the sort of stiff, monumental story. But there's some kind of shift. You're right, there's a shift from the Sao Paulo moment to this Bahia moment. And I think this, partly she's rejected, of course, to not get the teaching position, but she must have known she was not going to get it. Like, in a way, she's one of the least stupid people you could think of. She knew what was going on. But I think Bahia was like, embraced her for the very same reasons that she was rejected in Sao Paulo. They really, really, she loved it there and she was much loved. So I think she had this idea that the last thing to arrive is the object that you see in an exhibition. Like there's all this other activities. So I think she sort of said, okay, let's put in motion the production of theatre, of film, of collections. Let's work with making things, and then some kind of museum will come out of that. So another way to say it is that she thought it was a question. Like somebody said, you should make a museum. She was like, okay, that's a question. And a really good question, you don't just give the answer, you kind of keep the question floating. So she invented sort of systems that just keep it, I mean, I don't think anybody knows really what went on at the MAM. Even all the experts, they don't really know. It's a question. She just turned everything into a bit of a question. And Beatriz and I, we are teachers, right? And as teachers, we're also looking for teachers too. We're looking for people that keep questions alive. And I think her ability to keep it unclear, what is a museum? This was something special. So maybe what she did in Bahia was more interesting than what she did in Sao Paulo, maybe.
Right, because Sao Paulo is still, I mean, the way the Sao Paulo Museum came up and was the idea of bringing Western, for the most part, art to Brazil, right? I mean, and this collaboration with Bo Bardi is still very much in the old concept of what a museum is, with a collection, Bo Bardi was a collector. I mean, he had access to all these different places where he could basically bring artworks to Brazil. But what is fantastic about the MAM is that it's such a contemporary idea of what a museum is, right? I mean, but it's so much ahead of time, right? The idea the museum without a collection, with all these activities, events, involving multiple actors that in the end create this new form of an institution. And I think in that sense you have to also think about her as in a way as a pioneer of this idea of the museum as a pedagogical institution, a collaboration. The idea of the she always collaborated, but in Bahia much more. I mean, in Sao Paulo too, because he's collaborating with Bardi, with that other guy, the sponsor, whatever his name, Chateaubriand, who was the sponsor of the museum, etc., etc. But in Bahia, he's collaborating with the kids, he's collaborating with local people, he's collaborating with anthropologists, he's collaborating with all kinds of characters. In a way, you can say her work is all collaboration, and also that's a very significant undermining of the idea of the genius architect, the solo architect, and here is my building, so she's on the one hand extremely talented, and on the other hand is very much open to collaborations with all kinds of people. In all the works that she did, there is collaboration, right?
I guess this is a good kind of way of going to the next question I had in mind. In your book, The Radical Pedagogy, that's just on the table now, you talk about this moment with Giancarlo Di Carlo in 1968 when he was directing Milan Triennale. And there's a picture that I'll try my best to show you, but I'm more than happy to just give it to you as well, and then you can take a look. Just give me a second, sorry. Yes, this moment. So this is a moment where you will see that the students are us. I mean, of course, I'm sure you'll do a much better job explaining it, because the way it has been explained in this book is just brilliant. Is that the students that are sitting outside are basically revolting against the Milan Triennale. And I don't know if you know if Giancarlo's practice and who he is. He's an architect that already has anarchist affiliations pre-1950s. And in this moment, you see this kind of, clash between the radical teacher, you say, and then the radical students. And even though the radical teacher is someone who's actually trying to kind of, push the boundaries further, the students are still revolting against it for the sake of, going against the current conditions and situations. And there's this moment this moment specifically captures Giancarlo listening attentively and then trying to kind of, you know, like observe and understand the needs and desires of the students. And I mean, I think one thing that you say here is this kind of, you know, the idea of radical pedagogy being an almost oxymoron. That kind of that fascinated me because, I mean, I want to quote you actually because I think it's so brilliant. Let me just try to find it. You say that the very nature of education cannot forego either authority and tradition. Within the context, I mean, and then it's basically being something that somehow has to, you know, dissolve in the kind of, you know, assimilation due to the kind of generic mainstream education that's been imposed through the structures. And I guess I'm quite interested in thinking of the conditions within the UK, because when we're and a lot of the education that we receive, we receive right now, do not even talk about the colonial discourse, and it's not even kind of, you know, have the vocabulary necessary to kind of address the atrocities and violences that happened then. So I'm just kind of I guess it's more like a question, a provocation as well. I'm just quite interested in this kind of idea of what it would mean to be this, you know, I guess radical figure that can potentially undermine those conditions, and what does it mean to function within the current conditions and be the radical pedagogue now, I guess.
Well, I'm super happy that you have this reaction to the book, because in fact the book was supposed to be, in a way, a provocation, right? I mean, to go back not only to this moment of the 1960s and 70s, where there was an incredible creativity in all parts of the world, from Latin America to Australia, New Zealand. I mean, there are how many countries are there represented? 100 and more than 100 countries, 116 case studies. So a moment in which whatever architectural education was thought about is completely in upheaval. But the impulse behind it was also the idea that we seem to be in a moment that there was a lot of conformism, that we were still. And this, I think, it has changed, because now you mentioned a couple of things that are happening actually in the schools, that there is been, particularly in more recent times with Black Lives Matter and all of this, a little movement. You know, I used to think the schools in which we teach, that they were very passive, you know, all kinds of things could happen, and the students will not react, and all of a sudden this is changing, right? But it's interesting to go back to this moment of the 60s and see how the students, so it's a revolution from the bottom up in most cases. Because the AA, for example, in London, had fantastic teachers, if you think about it. From, the whole Archigram was teaching there, the whole, you know, the Smithsons was teaching there, etc., etc. And nevertheless, there was this incredible proliferation of students' initiative, little magazines, little ideas. This idea of the bus that will take students from the AA to Bristol to I don't know where, to different schools in which they will exchange ideas that completely transform architectural education. And the problem because this is also a pedagogical issue for me, this is the PhD program that I direct and at Princeton, and I do these kinds of collaborative, again, research project with my own students, in which the distinctions between the...
And this is a project since that you've been conducting since 2010, I guess,
Yes,
right?
I taught this seminar at Princeton, and then I taught it again, and then we did it as an exhibition in the Lisbon Triennale, and then it was picked up by Ren Koolhaas, etc., and it was part of the Biennale of Venice of 2014, completely transformed and expanded, and then it went to Warsaw, to Poland, in another iteration, and the project kept going. The number of case studies kept growing, because we have a very good website, and people from all over the world start writing, you know, and say, you know, you may not know, but when the junta in Argentina threw away all the best faculty. They mounted this alternative school called La Escuelita, and they invited people from Italy, like Rossi was there or whoever, and we didn't know about this case, and this person from Argentina wrote the case. So somebody will write from other places in Australia, in New Zealand, you know, South Africa, everywhere, right? And all of a sudden, instead of being a book written by a bunch of group of students from Princeton, as the Clipperstown Fall was more, it became like more of like a crowdsourcing, because they will contact us. We haven't seen many of these authors. There are 116 authors. We don't know many of them, and we probably will never meet them in person. But we had this collaboration by email. We edited their tests. They send images. We give some advice, and they end up in the book. So in a way, the book represents this collective research into this explosive moment of the 60s and 70s, which I hope it brings also some something to think about what could happen today in a moment in which so many things have changed in our lives, right? And it is a clear parallels between what is happening now and what was happening then too. You know, the civilian unrest, for example, of the 1968 has been clearly with us recently. The first preoccupations with the environment, with recycling, with experimental or emergency architecture, cardboard architecture. This is from this period in which these students were claiming that their school shouldn't be teaching about masters, but shouldn't get on with the program. And now we have similar questions and new ones, as you're saying, because we see the world also with new eyes.
Yeah. I mean, I have so many more questions, but I'm very conscious of time, so we have only 15 minutes left, and I want to open the floor to our audience to see if there's any comments, questions, and thoughts.
Thank you, and thanks for the talk. I'm very naive to all this. This is completely new to me, so my question may echo that. I was struck by the fact that the buildings all are located in nature, surrounded by nature. They've got nature contained within them, but the buildings themselves are extremely geometric, no curves, everything very, very square, and very, very definitely, therefore, it seemed to me a statement of a building, a human intervention. So I don't know if this is a question, but is there anything to say about that? About why did she not go organic and try to sort of link these things in some way?
Interesting.
I think it was a super, I was going to say sharp observation, but that sounds like I'm going geometric on you. I mean, I think it's a really, I don't know the answer firstly. I think it's a really great question, but I would be tempted to answer something like, just because she thinks the human is something small doesn't mean we don't have the right to make our. So I think you're right, absolutely right. The geometry is, if you think about it, for example, the right angle, which is even called normal, like, is the one thing you cannot find in nature, right? So our species has used the right angle a lot to say, hey, we are pretty important.
We are here.
So I think you're reading exactly right. When she makes these right angles in the middle of the forest, that's the mark of the human. So she's not saying we should dissolve ourselves. For example, in this picture, she was a really tough cookie. So if you think here she's a flower, like watch out, this is a kind of, So I think she preserves the right. The human has the right to make these marks, but they're in the end going to get overwhelmed, like in the end, and sometimes at the beginning. And that's what's interesting. She's sort of saying, we're going to make our mark, and it's going to be infected, and it's going to become unclear who came first, what's the chicken and what's the egg. So I think the question is terrific and would lead to a really good answer. I just don't have it yet, but I'm sketching for you sort of what it would be.
Yeah.
Like, you know, people who make gardens, they often do these sort of pergolas, right, where you make a very geometric shape as a kind of form of hospitality to something that will maybe in the end make the pergola disappear. So I think it's like this. It's like, and the other thing is that sometimes you didn't quite say it, but you almost say it right. Sometimes it's got kind of, it's not just a geometric, they're quite heavy, like concrete and stuff like that. And I think she does have the idea that concrete doesn't stand a chance. Like, you know, don't worry. If you look at that, the image of the children's play equipment, 1 year after the building opened, there were already plants coming up through all the cracks in the terrace there. So for her, it's sort of like, bring it on. Let's dance. But I don't know. I'm just meandering around here because I thought the question was too good. It's interesting, right? Smooth surfaces also you don't find so much in nature, right? Everything that's architecture, it's like architecture has the word human written on it. Human, human, human. So when you get an architect, and she's an amazing architect, who puts the human in this more modest position, that's radical, right? I think. What do you think?
As somebody has another question,
yeah.
I think you answer very well.
Sorry, can you wait for the mic to be with you?
Would you say that her kind of architectural vision was fully realised, or would you say the kind of anxiety and fear caused from the war like limited the kind of potential she could reach with a vision?
I missed the end of it. You say
I didn't understand.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Tom, we can't hear him so well. Can you increase the volume?
give it another shot.
Would you say that like her kind of architectural vision was fully realised, or would you say the kind of anxiety and fear from her experience of the war limited the extent to which she could kind of fulfil the potential of a vision?
What?
He's saying, was her vision fully realised, or did the anxiety that she was feeling also constrain her in some ways?
That's a very, very interesting question, which I think affects a lot of artists too, you know, and I think in a way it's probably a positive. I mean, it can. I suppose trauma is all over in our lives, and a lot of creative people, as Lina was, is one of the ways in which they deal with this trauma, whatever the trauma is, whether it's the trauma of war or whatever other thing. So in many ways, in her case, it doesn't seem to have been a limitation, but it has been like something that in other cases, obviously, it doesn't work out that well, right? All kinds of other problems.
And also, one thing that I was reading, I mean, I'm sure you know this already, the proximity of violence and like destruction was so close to her when she was living in Rome, and apparently she was, the building that she was staying in was sharing the same wall with Mussolini's Villa Tolerino.
Yeah.
That I wasn't know, so I'm imagining sometimes her, you know, like just walking down from her school, coming to her home, and knowing the fact that Mussolini is just living next door to you.
Right.
It must be quite I mean, of course, like anxiety-driven relationship, I guess, to your own locality and, I guess, household, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there are all these unconscious things. I mean, about the war itself and about the destruction, she's very vocal about it, and not so much about the political thing with Mussolini. I mean, this is also the complication of that she married Bardi, and Bardi was actually a very complicated figure, you know, which on the one hand, he was totally in favor of fascism. And he published this magazine, Quadrante. On the one hand, he's in favor of modern architecture, but he's also in favor of fascism. Why does he marry this guy? It's completely crazy. It's a very contradictory relationship, right? And in fact, I think her best years is when she they split basically, and she went to live in Bahia. I think that was the best moment. I think. But the complication politically, I think we cannot avoid that either.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, yeah. If you think about your question, right, which is interesting, there's no good answer, right? It's not like, what about, for us either, right? For anyone, like, is anxiety good or bad? Like, we certainly have friends, right, that they should be anxious about what they're doing, and they're not, like, you kind of want them to be, and then there are others who say, you're just too anxious. So there's no good answer. I think Beatriz has shown the way in which anxiety was feeding the work, and you're asking in which way was it holding back. We'll never sort of know. She was amazingly productive. Like, when you said, was her work kind of held back? I mean, I said before, everybody's jealous of her, right? But we'd be even more jealous if this is what she was, held back. Right? Like, what would be the full-on? But I was tempted.
Held back doesn't
But
count.
I was really tempted to do a similar answer to Beatriz. Like, this is a bit weird that she's living with this person, and he's not boring, but might be a little bit evil, right? Like in a Batman movie or something. It's like, you know, he's not a good person, but it's interesting. And maybe she used this, but there seems to be a sort of a dependence thing that she wanted that guy to be there. And maybe if we knew her, which none of us do, maybe he totally pissed her off, and that actually kept feeding the energy. But all the information suggests that there was quite a mutually respectful collaboration between the two. Like, actually, he, you know, it's just a weird and for most of us, embarrassing relationship. By the way, that's why we always insist on calling her Lina Bo, not Lina Bo Bardi, as if, you know, why attach the guy's name? You know, again, once again, does she become the property of this person? But my sense is if there are many people in Brazil that were really close to her and can confirm that she was really feisty. She was a, you know, take no prisoners kind of person. But they're very loyal to her, and maybe they would be the ones that could say, you know what, you know, there was certain things that she could have done that maybe she didn't. But
we don't know enough. I mean, there is all this moment also of dictatorships in Brazil. I mean, one will need to know more about what was her position there. But you know, speaking about living close to Mussolini, I mean, she married this guy that has been supporting Mussolini. You know, there is this famous magazine Quadrante that he was the editor with La Casa del Fascio there. You know, that's pretty intense.
so these are sort of paradoxes, right?
That's the paradox of her.
The house is a kind of elite playground for artists and musicians and cultural figures, international figures. In that sense, kind of aristocratic, the rich and famous, the influential, and then there's Bahia, the kind of popular, revolutionary, more Marxist kind of environment. Maybe it's like with the other question, we don't have answers because she's interesting. She's complicated.
It's complicated.
But the desire to be kind of close to the fascist thing, that most of us are a little bit uncomfortable with that. Right? But it may have been super good for her, super useful. Yeah.
Sorry, can you wait for the mic again?
Thank you. Would you consider maybe that actually that same architecture is like a critique of this fascist modernism? Like she's somehow maybe saying, because like the glass house is very modern, but then from some facades you can see that she's bringing in like colonial architecture, plants. So would you consider that she's maybe answering back also to that kind of male-dominated modernism? Also, I'm thinking on Nijmeger's, like about the question of like this architecture not being organic, and in comparison to Nijmeger's kind of organic museums architecture.
Yeah.
It's true that the glass house has two sides. I mean, we talk about the fact that the most canonic images present this kind of glass box and those are the beautiful images that we. But if you go back, I mean, it's a completely different story in the back of the house. That is much more vernacular and with all these structures that were already there, and this you cannot reconcile, right? So there is this confusion there, I mean, which I think is very beautiful.
Yeah, we've done a kind of obsessive study about this house, which really connects to your question a lot, and we try to argue actually that important part of the house is the closet in the bedroom rather than this thing that hangs out the front. So we're totally with the spirit of your question. But your bigger question, like, is it a critique of modern architecture and also the sort of macho dimension of modern architecture? I'm really obsessed with that, and I can trace you again a little bit. If you look, there's a very, very big sort of plant fetish in modern architecture. So you just name your master that you want to kill, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, all of them, and they actually got really a plant thing going. And then you can be like the police and say, okay, but are you letting the plants really take over, or are you domesticating them? And it's complicated in every case. But Lina Bo is very close to figures like Rudowski and Gioponti that were thinking that there was a new kind of architecture that was, where there was confusion about was nature or architecture in control. And then we could decide whether that was modern or not, modern architecture or not. But you're right, it didn't look that modern. It was more, kind of like the back of the house of the Casa de Vidro. But is there like a secret life of modern architecture that was kind of a plant life? And this is a little bit where I would want to go. Because the boring guys that were running modern architecture, they were psychopaths and all of that, but they were also were not necessarily in control. So
what are you thinking about?
Le Corbusier, right? The Esprit Nouveau Pavilion, 1925,
is the tree in the middle, totally trapped by the pavilion, no?
So there's two ways to go. Say, okay, let's out with modern architecture because it's like doing things we don't identify with and made by people we don't identify with. Or you can say, no, we don't have to throw it out, we just have to look more closely at it, and it was much weirder than we thought, and it's not doing the things that it says it was doing. Almost everything that modern architects said about their work is not true. So we don't necessarily have to throw it away. We can say, okay, what was it really doing, and stay with that. And so I think that Lina Bo is more in that spirit. She doesn't want to throw away modernity as such, but she wants to uncover this repressed dimension of it. And you're right, in the end that will undo it, right? In the end it's like, okay, once you've got into the plans, after a while you get less and less interested in what they were doing. And there was, in Milan in those years in the 40s, unbelievably interesting experiments with architecture and plants. And I think she found a way in Brazil of really perfecting them. And sorry for the long speech, but I prefer the idea that she was working on this kind of project already in Italy, and then Brazil was this great laboratory, rather than this sort of exoticism that she arrives in this tropical environment and she becomes a little bit tropical. No, I think she was, I don't know. But again, it's not a good answer, it's a great question. So far, 3 great questions, 3 lousy answers. You're the winners. This is Saturday, so this is sport. We're like almost finished.
So I guess we have
40
time
love at this point.
for one last question.
Just on what you just said, actually, I'm from Milan originally, and that really makes me think of Milan as an image, because Milan is, I mean, that's the nice side of Milan. It's not the Milan periphery where I grew up, which is a different deal, but in the centre you get these beautiful courtyards, which are, so it's very much, it's got this kind of austere architecture from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you know, when they were there. It's got very solid kind of buildings in the centre, but these beautiful, very green courtyards, and it really makes me think of that. Anyway, so just as a
That's
thing
interesting,
But again, about Milan, so, you know, the when you were referring to the big green wall that your mate has
Yeah.
built, is that the big high-rise building near
Yeah.
Porta Garibaldi? Okay.
Yeah.
So I love that building. Lots of people love it, but it's also kind of, I've mixed feelings about, you know, how it actually works and what it is, because it's kind of like this pinboard image for how we could do housing and social housing. In particular, lots of people have commented on that, sort of having very green vertical gardens, and it's a beautiful idea. But actually, the reality of it is that it's an extremely exclusive building. You have to be minted to live there. It's not a social housing, high-rise building thing. And I don't know how much of it is due to the fact that actually the maintenance of the vertical garden is extremely expensive, and how much it's to do with just the social conditions of who gets to live in nice places. But where would you say that kind of contemporary architecture, modern architecture, well, contemporary, I suppose, sits in relation to her legacy, for example, which, you know, it sounds like what she was about was much more inclusive and about engagement and collaboration, as you said. So what any thoughts on the relationship between those, that example and what she was trying to do?
You want to do it, or okay, so Stefano Guerri, the architect, he's great. But you're right that building is actually to maintain the tree. It's a building in which instead of terraces, there are trees growing all the way up the building. So it's kind of, you live inside a kind of vertical forest.
Vertical garden.
Right? So yeah, you're right. If you do the math, it doesn't really work out. They're spending more money to keep those trees there than the trees are providing oxygen. But most architects are trying to convey an idea. Architects don't care about humans that much. I mean, you know, if you look at the pictures that architects show, they very rarely see people, right? But they like to make an idea of a possible future. And what Stefano's saying is a possible future in which we kind of make buildings in this more intimate relationship with trees. He's also the director of the Triennale di Milano, so he makes exhibitions. For example, one of them was on the intelligence of trees. So, so suddenly it goes from that situation where you're right, it's rich people living in a tower, to an incredible exhibition that shows how trees communicate with each other. Right? So he's really very serious about treating plants as a kind of model. Maybe the current version that he has is more Instagram than, you know, the solution that's needed. In terms of Lina Bo's work, it seems to me what you don't, maybe I'm wrong about this, but she's never saying like, this is the future. Stefano's saying, this is the future, we should be doing this. She's never telling anybody what to do. Right? She's a tough cookie, she's opinionated, she has a single project, I think, going her whole career, but she's never saying the whole world should be like this. In that sense, she's more of an artist. She's really making this remarkable work. I mean, the Cisc Pompeii building, which we showed a little bit of a few times, it's amazing. It's just, you know, ridiculously good. Would she say that there should be schools like that? Because it was a kind of a school also, everywhere. She probably would say yes, but she would definitely not want it to look like that. Right? And she wouldn't do it the same. So I don't know. Of course, we're fans. You can get that. Right? So she can do no wrong, other than marrying that guy.
I think it's so contemporary to have pay attention to, you know, when she's doing the house and she makes a list of all the animals living in the site. I mean, that's incredible if you think about it, right? Because it includes all the insects of the different, you know, I mean, that is, and to make a space for these plants and these insects, well, in this moment, that is actually unbelievable.
Yeah, I guess like, I mean, the way she breaks through those like hierarchies that are already established and imposed by human, and the way she does that is so, I think, brilliant. And I guess that's the reason why it's the title of, you know, your presentation today, that her approach is, you know, like just very much focusing on her surrounding, and this very much trans-species, transnational historical approach is very much was visible in your whole presentation. I guess this is a great point to finalize it. Thank you so much for your generosity and time, Beatrice and Mark. I mean, it has been so brilliant to have you here. If you would like to trace back this conversation, hopefully it will be available on our website, on our socials in the next few days. But again, I mean, a round of applause, of course, for our speakers. Thank you so much again.